Americans have one of the most analyzed cultures on the planet, and for good reason. From the way they eat to the way they think, almost every habit traces back to something genuinely bizarre. So today I'm breaking down every major American stereotype and explaining exactly where each one comes from, starting with one that sounds fake but is backed by some truly unhinged numbers. The obsession with ice. 51% of Americans self-identify as ice-obsessed. Not ice cream, not iced coffee. Ice, the frozen water cube. They consume roughly 400 pounds of ice per person per year. 56% won't drink water unless it's cold, and 53% say if there's no ice available, they just drink less water entirely. They would rather dehydrate, and the whole thing traces back to one man, Boston's Frederick Tudor, known as the Ice King, who in the early 1800s started shipping ice from frozen New England lakes to the Caribbean, New Orleans, and India. He created the first international ice trade, which is already insane, but here's where it gets dark. His strategy was deliberately manipulative. He'd give away free iced drinks to bars and restaurants to create dependency, then start charging once people couldn't go back. He literally said, "A man who has drank his drinks cold at the same expense for 1 week can never be presented with them warm again." That's not a business plan, that's a supervillain monologue, and it worked. By 1850, 100,000 tons of ice were being shipped annually. One guy rewired an entire nation's taste buds using the exact same playbook as a drug dealer. Europe never experienced anything close to this. Which is exactly why Europeans still look at Americans like they're unhinged when they ask for extra ice at a restaurant. But if the ice thing seems excessive, wait until you see how Americans handle food portions. The portions are massive. American cookies are now 700% larger than the USDA standard portion size. 700%. That's not a typo, and it's not an exaggeration. That is a cookie the size of a small dinner plate, and somehow nobody batted an eye. Here's the thing, marketplace food portions started creeping up in the 1970s, then exploded through the 1980s, and they just never came back down. Cooked pasta now exceeds standard portions by 480%, muffins by 333%, steaks by 224%, bagels by 195%. These aren't specialty items at novelty restaurants. This is just what food looks like now, and the growth hasn't slowed down. From 1986 to 2016, the total number of entrees, sides, and desserts across all major fast food chains increased by 226%. More items, bigger items, more calories per item. Every category got larger across the board. But here's where it gets fun for international viewers. US fast food portions are roughly 50% bigger than their UK equivalents. A Starbucks small in America is 89% bigger than a UK small. An American medium is actually 24% bigger than a UK large. Let that sink in. You order a medium coffee in New York, and it's physically larger than the biggest size available in London. Domino's largest pizza in the US has 31% more surface area than the UK large, almost a third bigger, and the reason is painfully simple. The marginal cost of adding more food is almost nothing for restaurants. A bigger portion costs them pennies, but makes the customer feel like they're getting a deal. It's not generosity, it's a marketing strategy that accidentally reshaped an entire country's relationship with food. But at least the food is quiet. Unlike the people eating it, they are all loud. There's actually a scientific explanation for this one, and it's not Americans are just obnoxious. It's called the Lombard reflex. Every human on Earth naturally raises their voice when background noise increases. Completely involuntary. And American public spaces, restaurants, bars, malls tend to run louder than their European equivalents. So Americans aren't choosing to be loud, their brains are literally compensating for the environment. But here's where it gets interesting. Americans also maintain greater physical distance during conversation than most Europeans. About 2 feet of personal space minimum, which means they're projecting their voice across a gap that a French or Italian person would never leave open. Europeans will literally chase Americans around a room trying to close that distance, while the American keeps backing up like they're being cornered by a street vendor. There's a cultural layer too. America was founded by people who spoke up against a king. Vocal assertion is baked into the national identity. In Britain, louder speech was historically associated with lower social classes. In America, there's no such stigma. Loudness just signals that you have something to say, but here's the kicker. Human hearing naturally flags sounds that feel out of place and amplifies them while drowning out familiar ones. So an American speaking at a perfectly normal volume for Dallas might sound deafening in a quiet cafe in Lyon. They're not objectively louder, they're louder relative to the room. And honestly, the stereotype might have less to do with decibels and more to do with presence. The world already listens to America at full volume through news, movies, music, and social media. So when an actual American shows up in person, it's not that they're screaming, it's that the volume was already at max and they just turned it up one more notch. Speaking of global perception problems, Americans also have a reputation for not knowing where anything is on a map. And that one's harder to defend. Ignorance of geography. Americans can't find countries on a map, that's the stereotype anyway. And look, there are plenty of viral videos of Americans pointing to Australia when asked to locate France. But here's the thing, there's actually very little hard data comparing American geographical knowledge to other countries. The stereotype is mostly built on vibes and embarrassing street interviews, which, to be fair, you could film in literally any country and get the same results. But there's a structural argument here that nobody brings up. America is enormous, like continent spanning enormous. Knowing your own country's geography is already a full-time job when you've got 50 states, multiple time zones, and a landmass that stretches from Arctic tundra to tropical beaches. Like, someone in the Netherlands can drive for 2 hours and accidentally end up in a different country where they speak a different language. An American can drive for 2 hours and still be in Texas. Still, in Texas, people in smaller nations pick up international geography through sheer proximity and daily necessity. Americans don't have that same pressure because their domestic geography is already absurdly complex. Add in the fact that American news media overwhelmingly prioritizes domestic coverage, and you've got a population that simply encounters less international geographical information on a routine basis. The real kicker is visibility bias. The American tourist who thinks Europe is a country becomes a legendary story that gets retold for decades. The millions of Americans who can absolutely find France on a map. Nobody remembers them because that's not funny, but at least geographical confusion is free. The next stereotype is going to cost you about 20% on top of your bill. The tipping obsession. This is the stereotype that catches international visitors completely off guard. Not the portions, not the flags, not the loudness. The tipping. Because in most developed countries, a tip is a nice little bonus you leave if someone did a great job. In America, tips aren't a bonus, they're the paycheck. The entire system is built on a structure where servers, bartenders, and hospitality workers receive substantial portions of their actual income through tips rather than guaranteed wages. Which means when you don't tip, you're not making a statement about the service. You're just not paying someone for their labor. And if you're visiting from a country where tipping is genuinely optional, nobody explains this to you at the airport. You find out when your server looks at you like you just insulted their family. But here's where it gets truly weird. The tipping expectation has expanded way beyond restaurants. You order a coffee, the iPad spins around with a suggested tip. You pick up a sandwich you ordered online. iPad flip, you buy a bottle of water from a counter where someone literally just handed it to you. iPad flip, suggested amount starting at 20%, climbing to 30% for a bottle of water. The percentages have quietly escalated too. What used to be a standard 15% tip is now considered almost rude. 20% is the new baseline. The whole system has shifted from discretionary to functionally obligatory. And it benefits exactly one group, employers who get to pay lower wages because tips cover the difference. It's a genuinely bizarre system, but at least it comes from a place of transactional logic. The next stereotype is pure chaos, because Americans will also be aggressively friendly to you for absolutely no financial reason whatsoever. They are overly friendly. Americans will smile at you on the street, ask how your day is going at the grocery store, and tell you they love your jacket in an elevator. And they mean absolutely none of it, or all of it. Honestly, nobody's really sure, and that's kind of the whole point. Small talk in the United States is a deliberate cultural tool. Light conversation about the weather, last night's game, whatever show everyone's watching. The goal isn't to communicate anything meaningful, or it's to create an atmosphere of friendliness. You're not exchanging information, you're performing a social handshake. In the workplace, this becomes borderline mandatory. You can't just walk into a meeting and say, here's the quarterly report. You have to ask about someone's weekend first. Comment on the coffee. Skip that part and people will genuinely think you're rude. Did you hear what Gerald did? Just walked in and started talking about spreadsheets. No hello, no nothing. Psychopath behavior? The whole thing traces back to American diversity. In a country with that many different backgrounds crammed together, small talk became universal common ground. It signals you place yourself on an equal level with whoever you're talking to. Nobody's above a quick chat about the weather, but here's where it gets weird. Americans are simultaneously some of the warmest verbal communicators and the most physically distant. They'll tell you their entire life story, but maintain a strict 2 feet of personal space. Warm words, cold shoulders, which is, not ideal. So is it real? The line between cultural friendliness and genuine intimacy is blurry enough that even Americans can't always tell the difference. But whether the warmth is authentic or just extremely well rehearsed, the result is the same. You will be smiled at, you will be asked how you are, and you will not be expected to actually answer. But if friendly small talk seems harmless, wait until you hear about what happens when Americans feel wronged, because they don't just complain, they litigate. They love lawsuits. Here's a stereotype that almost everyone on earth believes without question. Americans sue each other over everything. Spill coffee on yourself? Lawsuit. Trip on a sidewalk? Lawsuit. Someone looks at you funny? Believe it or not, lawsuit. But here's the thing, more than 90% of all injured Americans do absolutely nothing. They don't file a claim, they don't call a lawyer, they don't even contact the other person's insurance company. They just eat the loss and move on. Only about 4% ever hire a lawyer, and a tiny 2 to 3% actually bring a case to court, the most litigious country on the planet, and basically nobody sues. So why don't they? 3 reasons. First, being injured is genuinely awful. Pain clouds your thinking. Medication makes it worse, and most people can barely function, let alone navigate a legal system. Second, popular culture has spent decades portraying anyone who files a lawsuit as a greedy, bottom-feeding parasite. Movies, TV, the news, they've all hammered home the idea that plaintiffs are somehow reprehensible people, so injured Americans actively avoid becoming that kind of person. And third, most people just accept their injuries as bad luck. Tripped on a broken step, should have watched where you were going, which is, not ideal. But here's where it gets complicated. Despite Americans barely suing at all individually, US liability costs as a percentage of GDP are 2.6 times the Eurozone average and 4 times higher than countries like Belgium and the Netherlands. The system itself generates massive costs through class actions, the sheer number of lawyers per capita, and a legal environment that just operates differently, so the stereotype isn't about Americans loving lawsuits. It's about a legal system that produces enormous costs regardless of what individual people actually do. But at least a courtroom has air conditioning. The next stereotype involves a country where you literally cannot survive without a car. They drive everywhere. Here's the thing about Americans driving everywhere. People love to frame this as some kind of laziness thing, like Americans just refuse to walk, but that's not what's happening. Americans don't choose to drive everywhere. They're trapped in infrastructure that was built 70 years ago, and it gives them literally zero alternatives. Let me hit you with the numbers. 92% of US households have at least one vehicle, 22% have 3 or more, 78% of workers drive to work, and 88% of those people drive alone. That means over 75% of all commuting car trips involve one person sitting in one vehicle. And here's the kicker, most of those trips are under 6 miles. 6 miles? That's a distance you could cover on a bicycle in about 25 minutes, or on a bus in 15. If the bus existed, nearly 45% of Americans have zero access to public transportation. Not bad access, not inconvenient access, zero. The neighborhoods are designed so that walking, biking, and transit are physically impossible regardless of what you'd actually prefer. And this didn't happen by accident. After World War II, wealthy white families flooded out of cities into suburbs, and the dense streetcar networks that had served urban areas for decades got deliberately dismantled. That suburban migration drained city tax bases, killed public transit funding, and locked the entire country into car dependency for generations, which is, not ideal. The average American household now spends $12,295 a year on transportation, with 93% of that going directly to buying, maintaining, and operating personal cars. For low-income households, that number eats up roughly 30% of their entire after-tax income. So car dependency isn't just an inconvenience, it's one of the biggest drivers of economic inequality in the country, and most Americans can't opt out even if they wanted to, but at least they have cars. Because the next stereotype assumes they can all afford whatever they want. They are all rich. Here's the thing about America's wealth. Total US household wealth hit $175.3 trillion at the end of 2025. That's not a typo. That number is so large, it basically stops meaning anything. And when the rest of the world sees that figure, they assume every American is swimming in cash like some kind of bald eagle Scrooge McDuck. But here's where it gets complicated. The top 10% of households hold $8.1 million on average and control 67.2% of all that wealth. The bottom 50%, they hold $60,000 on average. That's 2.5% of the total. So when someone says America is rich, they're technically correct. When they say Americans are rich, they're describing roughly 1 in 10 of them. The median household household net worth sits at $192,700. The threshold to crack the top 1% is around $13.6 million. That gap between typical and elite is not a gap, it's a canyon with its own weather system. And mobility? The American dream says anyone can make it if they work hard enough. The data says something else entirely. More than 85% of people born into the richest fifth of households are still there a decade later. Meanwhile, more than half of those who start poor remain poor after 9 years. Only 3.6% make the jump from the bottom to the top 20%. 3.6. That's not a ladder. That's a lottery ticket. The racial wealth gaps make it worse. White households average about $1.5 million in wealth. Black households average $352,000. Hispanic households average $285,000. These aren't small differences. These are entirely different economic realities existing inside the same country. So the stereotype isn't wrong. Exactly. America is rich. Spectacularly, absurdly rich. But the distribution of that wealth means the average American's experience has almost nothing in common with the number that created the stereotype in the first place. The country is wealthy. The people are a different conversation entirely, but if you think the wealth gap is wild, wait until you see what Americans do to convince themselves they can close it. The hustle culture. Here's something that will genuinely mess with your head. By 1980, the average American work year had dropped to 1,800 hours. That's nearly half what it was a century earlier. Productivity was skyrocketing, wages were climbing, and America was legitimately on track to achieve Benjamin Franklin's dream of a 4-hour workday. That was the trajectory, and then the 1980s showed up and said absolutely not. The baby boom generation carried their countercultural self-expression ethos straight into the office and transformed work from something you did into something you were. Work became the central means to live your best life. Follow your passion, change the world. You weren't just supposed to do your job, you were supposed to be your job, and the money backed it up. Between 1980 and 2014, earnings of the top 1% tripled while the highest tax bracket rates got slashed by almost half. Suddenly, working weekends wasn't just culturally rewarded, it was financially rational in ways it never had been before. Here's where the cultural divide gets fascinating. A 2017 study found that when Americans heard someone worked long hours, they assumed that person was rich. When Italians heard the exact same thing, they assumed that person was poor. Same behavior, completely opposite status interpretation. That tells you everything about what hustle culture actually is. It's a status symbol, and it infected an entire generation. Pew Research surveyed American teenagers and found that 95% said having a career they enjoyed was extremely or very important. That beat out helping others at 81%, getting married at 47%, having children at 39%, and becoming famous at 11%. Career fulfillment wasn't just a priority, it was the priority. Above family, above wealth, above literally everything else, which is, not concerning at all. But here's the kicker. Signs of collapse are everywhere. Over 70% of startup founders report mental health impacts from their careers. 71% of Americans now support a 4-day work week. Younger workers have embraced quiet quitting and bare minimum Mondays, which is exactly what it sounds like. The hustle was never about efficiency. It was about the performance of effort, but if hustle culture is America's relationship with work, wait until you see America's relationship with itself. Extreme patriotism. Here's the thing about American patriotism that most people get wrong. They see the flags, the fireworks, the hand over the heart, and they assume it's all just blind nationalism. But American patriotism is built on something genuinely unusual. It's not rooted in ethnicity or shared ancestry or 1,000 years of monarchical tradition. It's rooted in an idea. America derives its entire legitimacy from a set of philosophical principles: natural law, liberty, individual rights, limited government. The founders took classical philosophy, blended it with Enlightenment thought, and said this is what we are. Not a people, not a bloodline, a creed. And every other nation's identity comes from who its people are. America's identity comes from what its people believe. That means American patriotism isn't loyalty to soil, it's loyalty to a concept, and the rituals around that concept have some wild history. Take the Pledge of Allegiance. Every American knows the hand over heart gesture. What most don't know is that before 1942, the official salute involved extending your right arm outward with your palm facing down. By World War II, that looked a little too similar to a certain other salute being thrown around in Europe, so Congress swapped it to the hand over the heart, which is, a reasonable adjustment. Then there's the 4th of July, basically the Super Bowl of patriotism. Parades, barbecues, flags on every porch, and fireworks that could be classified as small-scale warfare. New York City's Macy's show alone alone features over 56,000 individual pyrotechnic effects. That's not a celebration, that's a statement. But here's where the stereotype falls apart. Despite all the visible fervor, only 39% of Americans say they actually feel proud of their country most of the time, less than 4 in 10. And roughly 1 in 5 Americans on the political left say they feel shame about their country most of the time. Patriotism in America isn't a consensus, it's a battlefield. The left and right don't just disagree about policy, they disagree about whether pride itself is appropriate. International observers see the fireworks and assume that represents everyone. It doesn't. The stereotype overstates the unity by a mile. But if patriotism in America is really about loyalty to an idea rather than a group, then the next stereotype makes perfect sense. Because no idea has shaped American identity more than the belief that you should be able to do everything yourself. Rugged individualism. Every single stereotype we've covered in this video, the loudness, the hustle, the patriotism, the driving, the portions, the friendliness, the wealth mythology, all of it traces back to one thing. One foundational idea so deeply embedded in American culture that it's been called the master assumption of American political and economic thought, and that idea is rugged individualism. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that Americans had become an entirely new type of person. 3 centuries of constantly beginning over again on an ever-expanding frontier had rewired the national psychology. Pioneers developed mobility, optimism, inventiveness, and above all, a deep distrust of anyone telling them what to do. Free land served as an escape valve. Self-reliance wasn't just a nice idea, it was structurally possible. You could literally walk west and start over. Now, Herbert Hoover coined the actual phrase rugged individualism, but he was specific about what it wasn't. It's not selfish isolation. It's not laissez-faire economics exclusively benefiting the wealthy. Hoover argued it accompanied equality of opportunity and voluntary association. Even Tocqueville noticed that American individualism was never purely selfish. Americans had this weird habit of forming volunteer groups constantly, combining fierce independence with community action. Even Obama acknowledged it as core American character, so it's not just a right-wing talking point. It's the operating system, and it's measurable. Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory identifies American society as one of the most individualist on the planet, though minority communities including African Americans and Asian Americans display slightly higher collectivism, which makes sense. Collectivism is often a survival response to being excluded from the individualist system's benefits. But here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Researchers found that Americans respond negatively to positive stereotypes about their own group. Tell an Asian American Asians are good at math, something objectively complimentary, and they don't feel flattered. They feel depersonalized. Their desire to be seen as an individual is so strong that even a compliment triggers a negative emotional response. Americans are so individualist that complimenting their group offends them. I don't know what to tell you. And that's the thing about rugged individualism. It's neither purely good nor purely bad. It encourages growth, freedom, innovation, and the belief that you can become whoever you want. But it also creates jarring expectations of total self-sufficiency, cutthroat competition, and a society that sometimes forgets not everyone started at the same line. Every stereotype in this video is a downstream consequence of this single idea. The loudness is confidence in your own voice. The hustle is proving your worth through effort. The patriotism is pride in a system built around individual rights. The driving is literal independence. The portions are abundance you earned yourself. Rugged individualism is the root code. Here's everything else is just the output. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.